All right, I think it's time for us to begin. Thank you so much for coming to our panel on the corporate university. You may be more depressed when you leave than when you arrived, and I apologize for that in advance. I'm Sarah Chinn. I teach at Hunter College in the CUNY system. I'm a former executive director of the Center for Lesbian Gay Studies, which is sponsoring this wonderful conference. And I was really thrilled to be asked to moderate this particular this particular panel since our chancellor, the chancellor of CUNY, recently said in a speech to trustees that the university should look to corporations and businesses and industry as a model for higher education. And so this is an issue that's really, particularly those of us who are in public education, really on our minds. And we have 4 really wonderful presentations that explore this issue of the corporate university from a variety of different perspectives. Okay, so the way we're going to do it is we're just going to go from, I guess, your right to left with our presenters. I'm going to introduce each one in turn. They'll talk for about 12 minutes. We'll just go boom, 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 boom. And then when we're done, we'll have tons of time for questions, answers, conversation, engagement, whatever. So I'm first going to introduce Heather Roy, who is a doctoral student and graduate teaching assistant at the University of Iowa in the Department of Communication Studies. She earned her master's at Syracuse University in the Communication and Rhetorical Studies department. Heather studies how discourses of power shape, privilege, and marginalize identities, and the ways in which those identities are performed, read, and situated in everyday life. Her work is broadly situated in the field of rhetorical theory and criticism, with an attachment to gender and sexuality studies, and unless the name of her presentation has changed, she's going to be talking about queers in the classroom, disrupting traditional notions of coming and being out of the closet.
Do anything and you're already applauding, so
we're already excited.
I first became interested in studying coming out in the classroom when I started teaching myself. In my personal and professional life, I'm out to my family, my friends, my coworkers, but when I entered the classroom as an instructor, I suddenly felt this need to silence my sexuality. Me being a lesbian didn't seem pertinent to teaching speech class, nor did it seem appropriate since I was the one in charge. I didn't try to pass, but I wasn't necessarily open about my sexuality. So this made me question, what was it about the context of the classroom that made me want to call it the closet? Why did my authoritative role as an instructor make me feel awkward about coming out? I wondered if other queer professors felt the same way. So this research project blossomed. I began searching journal articles, books, literature, anything to read coming out narratives from queer professors, and to learn about their experiences in the classroom. Their opinions did differ. Some felt obligated to come out, whereas others felt like the classroom was no place to do so. However, those who did come out in the classroom, there were some general themes that popped up regarding why they came out and the way that they did it. Before I get into the details of those narratives, though, I do want to just talk briefly about mainstream discourses and how those discourses characterize coming out in comparison to these individual experiences that I'll discuss. So mainstream discourses characterize coming out as this singular, depoliticized event that's very liberating, for LGBTQ individuals who build up this courage and then they burst out of the closet and they're all happy and it's done. But this mainstream idea is problematic. Queer professors who come out to their students challenge this heteronormative understanding of coming out because they do so time and time again with the associated risk of losing their job, diminishing their credibility, or getting verbally or physically attacked. Coming out narratives are encouraged, or some would say imposed on queers because of heteronormative ideologies that place emphasis on people's sexuality as an identifying trait. So if one is not straight, then they must admit that they are queer, otherwise they're assumed to be heterosexual. So coming out narratives serve as this political public act of identity marking and making. So these themes of private versus public and the need to confess that are emerging from what I'm talking about already should cue to you that it's no surprise that most of my work is grounded in Michael Warner's conceptualization of the private-public spheres and also Foucault's theory of the confession. The act of coming out is private, but a political act of identity construction. The private must be made public in order for the person to be understood. As Warner argues, being in public is a privilege that requires filtering or repressing something that is seen as private. The rhetorical act of coming out takes a private, intimate part of one's character and makes it a public, political subject to be discussed, observed, and discriminated. But as Foucault argues, one confesses or is forced to confess. The act of confession is connected to private and public life due to the power systems in place that require people to reveal their so-called inner truths. In Foucault's History of the Sexuality, Part 1, he explains the act of confessing as a ritual that unfolds within a power relationship because an individual need not confess without the presence or virtual presence of a partner. There needs to be an audience when one confesses in order to have acceptance or rejection. Even though queer professors are afforded certain rights and privileges in the classroom, heteronormative beliefs and actions force queers to continually come out. Therefore, the metaphor of the closet is relevant in every queer's life, whether they are out to only a few people or to many. So now I want to go into some of the specific examples that I looked at within this narrative analysis. So from the coming out narratives I reviewed, there were three main reasons why queer professors came out. One, to serve social justice. Two, to be authentic teachers, and three, to be role models for questioning or self-identifying queer students. I feel like the first and third aren't surprising, but the idea of authenticity did surprise me. So let's discuss these a little bit more. The first one, to serve social justice. Many LGBTQ instructors claim that using their bodies and identities in the classroom as representation for all queer people helps serve social justice. In an article from the Journal of Multicultural Education, Jeff Sapp, an out gay instructor, discusses his personal reasons for coming out in the classroom. So I quote him here. He said, "As an act of social justice, I simply wanted to use my newfound voice. I wanted to speak about reflection and how it had changed my life. I wanted to be identified as my authentic self, as an aspect of which was my gay identity. I wanted to break the silence that some gay lesbian people feel and that gay lesbian educators particularly feel. I wanted to end some stereotypes and educate. I wanted to model that my journey to my real self had drastically changed who I was and thus how I taught." Sapp's narrative also connects with theme 2, the idea of authenticity, because he talks about no longer hiding his true identity. So to be authentic teachers, the idea of being out and its association with being authentic is repeatedly mentioned in these narratives. The heteronormative belief that staying in the closet means a queer is hiding their true self or lying spurs this belief that being out of the closet means you're being authentic. In an article from the New Directions of Adult and Continuing Education, one instructor's narrative regarded authenticity as a political and personal act. This instructor said, "My choice to be explicitly out is both an expression of activism and a political act. Yet it is also a point of my personal integrity and critical to my ongoing process of becoming grounded in my own authenticity rather than being who others said I should be." So it's clear, she points out that I want to be my authentic self and not who others should be. But there's also this connection to activism and being a positive expression, which takes me to the third theme about being role models for questioning or self-identifying queer students. This theme, I put it as third because it seemed like it always showed up after the first two themes. Once an instructor is at this point in their career and openness, many comment in their narratives that they did so in order to be role models for students struggling with their own identities. Professor Johnson's narrative addresses her desire and sense of responsibility to be out for queer questioning students. She said, "At the close of that academic term, I decided to be out in the classroom. Years of dodging, evading, and omitting while teaching were over. I did not want to write a script or have a set plan, and each course would be different in terms of timing and context, but I knew that I would no longer be nondescript regarding my sexuality. It finally occurred to me that dealing with the consequences of being out would be less problematic for me and for those students who are questioning queer, gay, lesbian, transgender, or bisexual than for me to continue to pass. As a successful, educated lesbian instructor, Johnson feels that the need to be out in all of her classes helps queer and questioning students to have a positive role model in front of them. There are so many accessible stories about GLBTQ people being bullied, killed, raped, and discriminated against for being out and visible. So professors like Johnson serve to create a different narrative, one of hope and appreciation. The next step in my analysis was looking at how queer instructors came out. It was obvious from the narratives that the ways that they did it unsettled this mainstream idea of coming out because they avoided the declarative "I'm gay" statement that's so common in media portrayals or personal life. So, in general, when a queer comes out to family members, friends, or anyone else in the context of maybe you could call their personal life, they typically come out using a declarative statement such as "I'm gay." A brief statement, but one that is full of meaning and identity making. Western culture expects this type of coming out story because it has been heard, reproduced, and reiterated until it has become normalized and expected. The declarative statement positions one's sexuality as direct, clear, and fixed. There's no ambiguity. Most professors admitted in their narratives that they preferred an alternative route, one that incorporated critical queer pedagogy within their golden teaching moments, and refused the declarative statement. Therefore, most professors noted that they waited for this golden moment to come out to their students. This term refers to the teaching opportunity where coming out fits nicely into class conversations, readings, and/or activities, and furthers critical thought and discussion. This approach to coming out is ultimately shaped by the classroom, and its goal is geared to supporting one's critical pedagogy. According to David Grunewald, critical pedagogies are needed to challenge the assumptions, practices, and outcomes taken for granted in dominant culture and in conventional education. Therefore, a queer instructor might stumble on a golden moment during a discussion about homophobia and relate it to their personal encounters with homophobic attacks by using a critical approach. This is true for one lesbian instructor who outed herself to her students in a golden moment, and they immediately began to ask her questions to get more involved. I quote her, she says, "The class was flustered and there was an awkward silence, and then suddenly the students began to speak. They wondered why I didn't look like a man, and if I felt like one, and they asked if I'd ever been with a man, and if it was hard being gay, and how I thought about gender, and while I kept my responses short, always referring back to Butler's work as a theoretical basis, my students got more and more engaged. Before long, I was able to shut up, and they took over discussion, debating topics such as the use of our binary gender system, and how we socialize children into specific genders and sexualities, and if we could rethink gender roles in literature and in society." This example illustrates how the golden moment allows the instructor's critical pedagogy and subtle way of coming out to function in a productive way, a manner that spurs reflective thought and group discussion. When examining coming out narratives in the context of the classroom, it is evident that the traditional understandings of coming out presented and reiterated in dominant discourses are false perceptions that limit and misguide people's comprehensions of what it really means to come out of the closet. Queer professors come out semester after semester, negotiating the personal and political spheres, and therefore disputing the heteronormative belief that coming out is a liberating, one-time thing. It is a lifetime process dealt with in various contexts with multiple types of people and outcomes. As a budding instructor myself and self-identifying lesbian, this project is pertinent to my research endeavors as well as my personal life. As a queer instructor, I find myself questioning whether or not to come out to my students, and if I do, what route I should take. After reading and reviewing numerous queer instructors' narratives, I do believe it is important to have visibility and awareness, but I recognize the hardships and fears associated with the openness of one's sexual orientation. After careful consideration, I agree that the declarative statement is not the most productive way of coming out in the classroom. Whether the course is feminist theory or geology, critical pedagogy is important, and critical reflection is a must. Likewise, I hold in high regard those instructors who have the courage and creativity to incorporate such critical work in all types of classes. As time goes on, as my experience as an instructor increases, and hopefully as the world turns into a more progressive, accepting place for queers, I hope to be as wise and diligent as those instructors in my community who are fighting for rights and striving to educate our youth to become more engaged citizens. I hope my pedagogy in the classroom and my actions outside of the university halls aid in the fight for equality for all GLBTQ people. Thanks.
Okay, our next speaker is John Treat. He's a professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures at Yale University and a former chair of Yale's LGBT Studies Committee. He's also taught at the University of Washington, Berkeley, Stanford, Texas, and Seoul National University. Treat is the author of Great Mirrors Shattered, Japan, Homosexuality and Orientalism, and of a forthcoming essay entitled Returning to Dennis Altman's Same-Sex Marriage and the Apparitional Child.
Thank you, Sarah. A conversation over tea at the 2009 World Economic Forum in Davos between the presidents of Yale University and the National University of Singapore led in what for Yale was lightning speed to the announcement in the fall of the following year that the two institutions would establish together a liberal arts college in Singapore that is now referred to as Yale NUS College. Debate in New Haven over Yale NUS has grown to include issues of freedoms of speech and assembly, academic freedom, faculty governance, curriculum reform, the crisis of the humanities, immigrant labor, the true human resource and financial costs of this venture, and the neoliberal branding of Yale around the globe. But the initial objection raised by the faculty was specifically to Section 377A of Singapore's Criminal Code, which outlaws male homosexuality. The LGBT Studies Committee, which I chaired at the time, wrote a letter to Yale's president on September 29th, 2010, raising questions about Yale's collaboration with what our colleague, political scientist Salah Ben Habib, has subsequently termed a boutique police state. The president did not respond to our letter, but the provost did. In a meeting with me and other members of the LGBT Studies Committee, we were assured that Yale had been told the sodomy laws were no longer enforced in Singapore. The provost was presented with material proving the contrary, but this did not stop the university from claiming, actually to this very day, that such is not the case. The argument made as early as the September 29th letter that, quote, the sodomy laws that remain in place, though seldom enforced, are in fact a kind of blackmail, with the threat of enforcement always looming as a form of policing, close quote, has never been acknowledged or contested by Yale. In time, however, the line that Section 377A was no more than an antique blue law that could be effectively ignored came to be joined by another claim made not only informally by the administration, but by some of the faculty, including signatories to the initial letter of protest. Far from being one of the few East Asian countries to continue to criminalize homosexuality, we now hear that Singapore is said to be, one, a gay paradise, and two, a favorable locale for us to practice queer theory. In my brief time this afternoon, I will sketch where I believe these curious claims originate. As Audrey Yu writes in the introduction to her important 2012 edited volume, Queer Singapore, Illiberal Citizenship and Mediated Cultures, quote, Singapore remains one of the few countries in Asia that has yet to decriminalize homosexuality, yet it has also been hailed by many as one of the new emerging gay capitals in Asia, close quote. This reputation dates from the early 2000s, when, after 2 decades of occasional liberalization of enforcement and police harassment of gay commercial establishments, i.e. bars and baths, the gay website Friday, housed on a Texas server to avoid entanglements with the Singapore authorities, succeeded in getting Singapore added to the international phenomenon of circuit parties, which attracted affluent gay men to various venues around the world for 2 or more days of intense partying. The first nation party, so named because it was scheduled for the same day as Singapore's national holiday, was held in 2001. But after the 2004 nation party attracted upwards of 8,000 participants, they were banned in Singapore and remain banned. But for a brief period, Singapore was seen in the same fabulous company as Montreal, Miami, and Palm Springs, albeit with the unique reputation as being a particularly efficient clearinghouse for Caucasian men to meet Asian men. At the time, the international press reported on Singapore's entry into the gay global. The gay press, such as The Advocate, picked up on it early, but by 2003, an article in Time entitled "Singapore, It's In to Be Out" stated that, quote, "Singapore is actually becoming a hell of a place to party with people of every race and sexuality," close quote. A year later, in an extended special report entitled "Gay Asia, Tolerance Pays," the Far Eastern Economic Review made the observation that newly marketed gay tourism was filling local coffers. "We begin in Singapore," the official report stated, "a state where contradictions abound, but where one message has hit home: gay rights make economic sense." While liberalization at this moment in time in Singapore has been credited by some to a ruling People's Action Party unnerved by opposition party gains in Parliament in the 1980s, most account for the early 21st century opening of Singapore to gay people, to the realization by the state, buttressed, some say, by Richard Florida's widely read The Rise of the Creative Class, that hospitality to gays was a key factor in building a creative economy, which is Singapore's goal. As one government minister was quoted at the time in the pro-government paper, The Straits Times, quote, "Remember, this is not about gay rights. This is about economic competitiveness." The founder and longtime leader of modern Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, conceded the following in 2007 after a lifetime of insisting that his country's Asian values were built around an unassailably patriarchal heterosexual family. And I quote, "If this is the way the world is going, and Singapore is part of that interconnected world, and I think it is, then I see no option for Singapore but to be part of it. They tell me, and anyway it is probably half true, that homosexuals are creative writers, dancers, etc. If we want creative people, then we have got to put up with their idiosyncrasies so long as they do not infect the heartland," end quote. Part of what interests us here is the reluctant embrace by the state of a Singaporean homonationalism, one that is more enthusiastically espoused by a number of gay activists on the scene. Next to Lee's concession that an economically vibrant Singapore, and that is in fact the single goal of the state, needs its homosexuals, is a 2003 open letter from the prominent gay spokesmen Kevin Wong, Alex Au, and Russell Hung. Quote, "Of course, as gay people, we do not believe that the laws and policies treat us fairly and in a non-discriminatory way. As citizens, we will continue to argue for change, not just for our benefit, but, as we firmly and sincerely believe, for the good of Singapore. Our wishes are entirely in alignment with the need for Singapore to be a more open-minded, tolerant, and cosmopolitan society, drawing from the well of creative diversity. In the face of long-standing Asian values rhetoric that homosexuals are less productive parasites on the modern nation state, Jun Zabilaga Pao, writing on the Singaporean press, notes that now, quote, the counter-argument comes appropriately from the portmanteau concept of homonationalism, which in the case of Singapore is, quote, not the reactionary equalizer of heteronormativity as commonly used in queer scholarship, but, quote, a neoliberal form of sexual politics. Neoliberal is the key word here, with special resonance as Singapore works to cement its position as a stop on the road of global capital. Queer Singapore, Yu states, has, quote, emerged from a specific geographical and historic set of conditions tied to the neoliberal regime of its post-colonial modernity. Once an English entrepot and now perhaps a unique global city nation-state with a leading role to play in the world economy, it is still with few resources but its people, both native-born and imported. What can look queer in the Singaporean context, and this brings me to the second point I wanted to make, is in fact a superstructural production of a very advanced post-industrial economy. Audrey Yu writes again, quote, local Singaporean queer culture has been constituted not as a result of the recognition of rights and liberation, but the disjunctive acceleration caused by economic and cultural reforms. In the popular cultures of contemporary gay fiction, gay theater, and lesbian nightlife, the sister transsexual, the Asian Mardi Gras gay boy, and the tomboy butch have emerged as exemplary figures of this queer culture. But it's precisely such carnivalesque exemplary figures that visiting queer studies scholars, including some from my own institution, see upon their arrival in Singapore and potentially misread. Part of the reason starts at home. As Rosemary Hennessy pointed out, quote, Madison Avenue and Wall Street share a certain ideological affinity with avant-garde queer theory, as the state's embrace of cultural diversity is at root the celebratory alibi for, quote, postmodern indeterminate forms of play and pleasure that are helping to consolidate a hegemonic postmodern culture. But another part of it comes from the ease of traveling theory. As Cindy Patton has noted of our misread of Taiwan's liberalized policies on homosexuality, in fact designed to contrast the Republic of China with the PRC, quote, jet-lagged and having crossed the international date line, confused even about what day it is, American-style queer theory does not know how to behave. It arrived in advance of mainstream gay civil rights discourse. I have a little more, but maybe I've used up all my time.
I think we can do one more paragraph. We can kind of conclude.
All right.
Great.
Singapore is not just other for Euro-American queer theory. It is potentially like the Gulf states, where other of our universities are now running campuses, a major financial center that increasingly rivals London and New York. It's with unbeatable flair that Patton notes, quote, the drift of discourses of sexuality is more like the Starship Enterprise's movement through the hypothesized wormholes than like a locomotive on the tracks of global capitalism. What I take from Patton is this. It is a mistake to see Orchard Road queer culture in Singapore as necessarily a post-Stonewall-like history, but what is there in place of such a history? I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Dake, who is a master's student at Simmons College in the Gender and Cultural Studies program. In 2011, she received her bachelor's degree from the University of Arizona in Tucson, where she worked with Students for Justice in Palestine and the migrant justice group No More Deaths, and also participated in community organizing to resist the dismantling of the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson public schools. Currently, Elizabeth is working on her thesis, which explores the role of emancipatory pedagogy in the anti-racist feminist classroom.
Right, so like you said, I went to the University of Arizona in Tucson, and I graduated in 2011. So my senior year was spent in the wake of SB 1070, the anti-immigration law, which legalized racial profiling, and then 6 weeks later, the passage of HB 2281, which banned ethnic studies. And so, my senior year was spent organizing against things like that. And then I graduated, and that summer, California passed a mandate for LGBT history to be included in social sciences in public schools. And so this paper is a comparison of the dismantling of Mexican American studies in Tucson alongside the simultaneous creation of LGBT history in California schools. And so I wanted to do this comparison, one, because the geography is there. California and Arizona are both historic Mexico. And also, I think the way that the two states are constituted in the cultural imaginary, California, blue, gay, Prop 8, Arizona, red, racist, SB 1070. And the ways that this sort of cultural imaginary actually erases communities of color in both states by focusing on queers in California and white racists in Arizona. And so I think that this work is important to reconstitute those communities as both the way that Roberto Rodriguez, who's an organizer in Tucson, states the Tucson Mexican-American community is a resistance creative culture. And so I think it's really important to look at the work that's being done by grassroots organizers in both states and to make sure that we're not erasing people whose work is very important. And then also to, obviously, homonationalist analysis. I wanted to look at the ways that we can apply homonationalist analysis to both of these measures, but I wanted to do so in a way that was accessible to the high school students that are affected by these policies. And so I'm really focusing on just the broader ideas of a reliance on liberalism and investment in diversity and multiculturalism, and also laying claim to the legacies of the anti-racist civil rights movement. Okay. So a brief history of Mexican American studies in the Tucson United School District. So the Chicano studies movement of the late 1960s was happening concurrently with the Black Studies Revolution, and especially at the San Francisco State University campus, there was a huge demand for ethnic studies, and the idea being to move the experiences and theory of people of color, which are either non-existent or on the margins, into the center. And so in 1968, you have high school walkouts in California and Arizona. In 1969, you have the formation of MECHA, and these groups, which were formulating what Mexican American studies would look like, had an emphasis on access, increasing access to education, centering Mexican American theory and experience, a huge emphasis on research because there was just a lack of research on the history, and then also a student connection with the community rather than an individual model of success. And so in 1974, there was a Supreme Court decision which ruled that the Tucson public schools were in fact segregated. In 1978, there was a desegregation order which said that there must be educational redress for decades of discrimination against people of color, and specifically cited Mexican American students and African American students. So today, the Tucson public schools are 60% Latino, and these educational gaps still remain. Although there was the desegregation order in 1978, there was little change until 1996 with the formation of communities and neighborhoods for Mexican American studies. 2 years of organizing led to citywide walkouts. High schools throughout the district participated. And in 1998, Mexican American Studies was created in the Tucson United School District, along with a larger ethnic studies department. Currently, Mexican American Studies was the only department to actually offer classes. There's an Asian American Studies, African American Studies, and Native American Studies departments, but those all do like student services. So MAS is the only one to actually offer classes. And these classes are core classes, which has to do with like time and money constraints, but is also an awesome thing because they are core classes. And again, this is keeping with the goal of the Chicano Studies movement to move Mexican American experience from the margin to the center. In 2009, a judge ruled that the desegregation mandate had been fulfilled, which community organizers disputed. But the judge said that TUSD had taken good faith efforts to equalize educational outcomes. But the judge also said that MAS was a crucial part of this decision. The TUSD school board committed to expanding MAS as a part of this ongoing effort to equalize educational outcomes. So the MAS program's stated goals are to close the achievement gap, student empowerment, preserving culture and history, and engagement with the community. They are intentionally counter-hegemonic, centering Indigenous and Chicano perspectives, and they practice liberatory pedagogy and have an emphasis on student-driven research. And they've been hugely successful. 97.5% of Mexican American students who take the MAS classes graduate versus 44% nationally. 70% enter post-secondary education versus 24% nationally. So these are massive, there are massive material ramifications for the Tucson Mexican American community because of these classes. And then there's also, Arizona has the AIMS testing, which is standardized testing. There's measurable positive correlation between the MAS classes and increased AIMS scores in every category except for math, which there are still increases in math, but it's not quite as big as the other ones. And these increases are most significant for low-income Mexican American students. And then also there's just so much testimony from students about how empowering and important these classes are. Just talking about reconnecting with history and culture and feeling empowered to engage with their community. So in May 2010, HB 2281 was passed, which banned courses in public schools, which, and this is quoting from the law, which promote the overthrow of the US government, promote resentment towards a race or class of people, are designed primarily for pupils of a particular ethnic group, and advocate ethnic solidarity instead of treating pupils as individuals. And it's very clear that this law was written specifically for the MAS program in Tucson. We know this because Tom Horn, the state superintendent at the time, had written a letter to the citizens of Tucson saying, these classes are dangerous, you have the power to shut them down. He closed by making an economic argument, which of course goes over really well with white people in Arizona, that your tax money is funding these seditious classes. John Huppenthal, who was the next state superintendent, ran with a campaign promise to stop La Raza. And then Michael Hicks, a school board member, in an interview said, honestly, this law won't be applied to any other of our courses. It was strictly written for one course, which is the Mexican American Studies program. And then just to put this in context, in 2000, Arizona banned bilingual education. April 2010 is SB 1070, the anti-immigration law. November 2010, there's a state constitutional amendment banning affirmative action in Arizona. And then also in 2011, there were two proposed laws which would revoke birthright citizenship for children born in the US to non-citizen or non-legal permanent resident parents. And I wanted to keep that in our minds because HB 2281 went through 3 separate drafts before it was finally passed. So I think it's good to keep an eye on what sort of legislation is brewing in the Arizona legislature. So in comparison, SB 48, the Fair Education Act, was passed in July 2011 in California. And this says that instruction in social sciences in public schools is to include the roles and contributions of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans. And this is an amendment to a law which also says to include the early history of California, both men and women, Native American, African American, Mexican American, Asian American, Pacific Islander, European American, and persons with disabilities contributions. So it is a very comprehensive law. And the addition of LGBT people and persons with disabilities, yes, this is a good thing, that they are being included onto this. And then again, the emphasis is on the roles and contributions of these groups to the economic, political, and social development of California and the US, and then with an emphasis on portraying the roles of these groups in contemporary society. Unlike Mexican American Studies in Tucson, this was not a grassroots effort. It was supported by Equality California and GSA, two nonprofits, and was championed by a state legislator. And the purpose is LGBT inclusion in instructional materials, so that LGBT people are no longer excluded from classroom discussions, and to have a fair and accurate portrayal of the people and events that have shaped US society. And the language of this, whereas the language in the MAS program is all about closing the achievement gap, about preserving culture and history, about student empowerment, community engagement, the language surrounding SB 48 is about setting a climate of respect in order to curb anti-gay stereotypes, stating that invisibility in the classroom leads to negative stereotypes, and that they want to make schools safer for gay students, decreasing bullying, and also to increase student sense of belonging and ability to learn. And I found this really fascinating that the anti-bullying rhetoric was it's in everything. It's the fixation of the legislation is about bullying, which obviously again fits into that 2010, 2011 time period with the phenomenon of queer suicides. And then, so the curriculum for California is still being developed. So we don't have the actual curriculum to look at, but there are proposals, and that's what I analyzed. In terms of integrating LGBT content into the K-12 curriculum of California public schools, there are 4 different levels of integration of multicultural content. And because of the wording of the California legislation, it seems as though the 2 levels that would happen in California would be the contribution approach and the additive approach. The contribution approach is the heroes and holidays approach. It's about worthy contributors and contributions as identified by the mainstream perspective. The author of this proposal noted Gertrude Stein and Harvey Milk as 2 people who would be included. Of course, they're both white, cis, and normatively recognized people. The additive approach is key concepts about LGBT people and LGBT events, and they're to be examined like any other political measures or events and from a dominant perspective. So the author posited the emergence of the LGBT community and legislation related to LGBT rights, and then also World War II and the Holocaust and ancient Greece as 2 possibilities for talking about LGBT people, which again is focused on the West. And yeah, just a few of the other things that the author brought up in terms of the 3rd and 4th level of integration. For the social action approach, which is the 4th level of integration, she talked about how students can be engaged with the larger society, and her example is the It Gets Better project. So I think that kind of just where this legislation is going. And so I wanted to look at compensatory and contribution models and the ways that this way of writing history serves a liberal, multicultural diversity discourse, by forcing marginalized people into, roles that are deemed valuable by mainstream society. And it really doesn't tell you that much about what actual everyday people are doing and how they live their lives, the ongoing functioning within this hetero-defined society. And it also, this oppression model makes it very difficult to think about queers as agents and not just as people who are acted upon by a queerphobic society. And then this is in contrast to Mexican American Studies, which is deliberately critical studies, critical pedagogy, very much about empowering students and providing them with the ability to do their own research, to make their own conclusions, while also championing community engagements. And so, as queer activists and academics, I think it's really important that we see these 2 different programs as, a part of a queer liberal strategy and the ways that SB 48's emphasis on contribution and additive approaches looks at queer victories as being about state beneficence. And I also thought this was interesting in terms of the rhetoric about enlightening queerphobic students so that they stop bullying, which I think there are some parallels to draw there. And then in the same way that MAS rejects liberalism by naming the state as racist, colonial, imperial, violent, xenophobic, that these victories are gained through community organizing and sustained resistance. And it rejects a simple oppression lens by focusing on history and culture in a resistance creative context. And then lastly, also SB 48 does what white queers do by conflating histories of heteronormativity and queerphobia with racism, colonialism, and xenophobia, and claiming the legacies of the civil rights movement and claiming the legacies of Africana studies and Chicano studies movements, and thinking about puar and ascendancy of whiteness, that we can see the way that SB 48 is functioning to help read white, gay, male students reclaim white privilege by seeing themselves reflected in the curriculum. And this is especially important in considering the larger anti-Latino, anti-immigration sentiments of both California and Arizona.
Our final speaker, Benjamin Abbott, is a PhD student practicing anarchist revolutionary on the streets, science fiction author, and genderqueer transhumanist visionary. Interests in radical politics and the humanities began with reading Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States as a teenager. A majored in creative writing and history with a minor in zoology, which just sounds fantastic, at North Carolina State University. And learning about the Plan de San Diego uprising and working with Richard Slatter convinced him to pursue an MA in history at the University of New Mexico. Current research looks at narratives of gender and sexuality across the Partido Liberal Mexicano and US anarchist feminist scene. A simultaneously critiques and contributes to the transhumanist movement at our blog, Queering the Singularity.
Thank you. In the conclusion to Queer Ultraviolence, a Bashback anthology, Tegan Iannelli makes a profound critique of academia that charges scholars such as Judith Butler with using queer radicalism for personal gain while doing nothing meaningful to annihilate oppression. Iannelli unambiguously portrays academic queer theory, or academic queer theorists, as sellouts, hypocrites, and parasites. This presentation asks those of us inside and outside the Imperial Academy to take Iannelli's allegations seriously and critically consider institutional knowledge production's role in social transformation. Though I do not wholly endorse Iannelli's assessment, I find it immensely valuable in the contemporary political context of ascendant liberal inclusion alongside flourishing oppositional scholarship. To echo Shivagami Subbaraman, what have all the erudite exegeses, vituperative analyses, and pain narratives of the last few decades accomplished? Assuming critical scholars actually want the revolutionary change that suffuses their work, many likely do not, is there any reason to believe that disciplining students, publishing papers, holding conferences, developing departments advances rather than hinders that cause? As much as I enjoy an engaging talk or monograph, I perceive far more smoke than fire when it comes to academic radicalism. Iannelli's insistence on the inseparability of theory and material practice offers a way to hold scholars accountable to the revolutionary projects we invoke. The waxing movement against homonationalism, what this conference is about, constitutes an opportune site in which to explore the deep contradictions immanent in the Imperial Academy, a term I take from Omar Ramirez's thesis on Chicano anarchism, and the nonprofit industrial complex. What does resisting homonationalism mean, and how does one do it? Does joining established anti-occupation networks as an out queer suffice? Does it involve direct action against gay militarist propaganda, as exemplified by the defacement of the Memphis Gay and Lesbian Center's homonationalist billboard in 2009, often attributed to Bashback, not necessarily committed by Bashback? Does it mean militant marches and sabotage campaigns? Or does it mean distinguished conferences and lobbying the United Nations? Or both? Does homonationalism center on Israel and imperialism in the Middle East, or does it additionally apply to the entirety of the US settler state? Why aren't we rioting right now rather than amiably chatting within the belly of the beast? These questions demand reflection. I wield Iannelli's insights to advocate, if not precisely his nihilist anarchy, at least an intense, immediate commitment to equality and freedom. I argue that radicalism for academics, parallel to Black anarchist Lorenzo Camboa Irvin's account of anti-racism for white folks, entails class suicide. First, Iannelli's critique warrants quoting at length in this book, by the way. Some idiot tries basing his thesis on the queer riots at the G20. Judith Butler delivers a speech at the New School about queer anarchism. Jack Halberstam seeks to valorize the negative and trace the antisocial turn. A class at the University of California is called Criminal Queer, yet the instructor denounces the activity of insurrectionaries on that very campus. One after another, queer academics line up to jump on the negativity bandwagon. Each appropriates the activity of insurgents toward the end of strengthening their own careers. They take antisocial activity and use it to reproduce the academy as a central engine of society itself. This is the ultimate treason. In theorizing about the activity of bashback, it is my ambition to demonstrate real queer assaults on the social order. In doing so, this collection should clearly expose those for whom negativity and revolt are mere matters of image, end quote. Iannelli thus indicts the university as an institution of recuperation and control, while specifically calling out scholars he feels are betraying queer radicalism. According to this interpretation, critical scholarship, queer theory in this case, functions to domesticate discontent and integrate it into the status quo without challenging the fundamentals of hierarchy and exploitation. Iannelli's analysis resonates with the work of scholars such as Jody Melamed, just to name one example, who in Represent and Destroy describes how the academy and publishing industry effectively transmuted materialist anti-racism into a manageable variation on liberalism in the decades following World War II. Yet even academics who detail historical processes of co-option rarely, if ever, target contemporary academia with the same scrutiny. Today's good scholarship constitutes the antidote for past bad scholarship. Institutional knowledge production, like alcohol, is the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. At most, the Imperial Academy becomes an impasse, colonialist to its core, but inescapable. In venerable revolutionary fashion, Iannelli holds no sympathy for apologism and extends the critique of the educational system to its logical conclusion. If something oppresses, obliterate it. Death to the academy, as Iannelli ends. Queer ultraviolence. The self-described transsexual anarchist fighting formation, Gender Anarchy, augments Iannelli's analysis of academia with attention to structure. Amidst uncompromising opposition to the capitalist industrial technological system, Gender Anarchy's manifesto entitled Transsexual Anarchy, Our Insurrection, contains a thesis on the Imperial Academy that aligns with Iannelli's. Freedom, the text asserts, is not possible when performing a job for money within the system, a social status, and otherwise depending on and partaking in the system, including its institutions of education, where there is no autonomy for free thinking, and so a person is basically owned by the institution and its ideological propositions and becomes their promoters. This strikes to the heart of the matter. Professors literally rely on state and/or capital for their daily survival and comfort. They have a direct economic interest in maintaining the inequality that enables their privilege. From a structural perspective, the idea that successful scholars would talk the talk without walking the walk makes perfect sense. Given this dynamic, I suggest that revolution requires academics to embrace class suicide. As inspiring and illustrative instances of real queer assaults on the social order, paradoxical though authenticity appears in this context, I turn to two recent rowdy public demonstrations in Oakland, California. Here, radical queer theory and practice merge with an utter absence of academic respectability and decorum. While state and capital tolerate conferences, departments, journals, and journals. Aggressive self-defense and property destruction prompt existential terror and violent repression. A book that declares no future offers only words, Iannelli writes. A riot that declares the same demonstrates a step towards insurrection. The powers that be wisely fear the latter over the former. I choose these examples not to fetishize the riot and physically fighting back, but to stress the necessity of materially contesting homonationalism and all oppression. So the first was on September 2nd, when over 100 radical queers disrupted the corporate Oakland Pride event. They tried to force their way onto a stage, danced in the streets, and rampaged through the city's financial district. These insurrectionaries carried a banner that read, "Queers, revolt," and they targeted and inflicted notable damage on a Bank of America building windows and ATMs. This action attested to the enduring presence of queer radicalism while simultaneously materially interfering with the operations of finance capital. It's a great video. I encourage everyone to watch it. Approximately a month later, in October 7th, 2012, around 200 people gathered in Oakland for a demonstration organized by Afghans for Peace. The day before, in San Francisco, police had attacked an anti-Columbus Day march that was going on during Fleet Week with military jets flying overhead, and the police had arrested approximately 20 people. So folks wanted to avenge their comrades. Event speakers quoted Frantz Fanon on killing colonizers. And there was one banner that all my ancestors killed colonizers. And they soon took to the streets, backed by cheering crowds. Small mass bands smashed up corporate and government buildings. Many in the crowd participated in toppling a fence that was previously erected to suppress Occupy Oakland. And the police, taken by surprise and afraid of the protesters, caught no one. And the marchers safely dispersed after an hour or so. Though it remains a fiercely controversial event, I view the protest as an impressive instance of direct action against the U.S. war machine. These two actions typify what I want to see more of. They unsettled, if only briefly, bourgeois property and the state's sovereignty. The question I invite y'all to consider is whether, and if so how, scholars can stand in solidarity with queer revolt that seeks to abolish the existing system. If not, can scholars at least treat queer radicalism without doing exactly what Iannelli charges and appropriating it for your own ends? And this was initially proposed as a workshop, so I hope this discussion continues after this panel if anyone's interested. And I'll conclude without any conclusion or finality in recommending a principle from Bashback and gender anarchy as a life practice. Destroy what destroys you.
Thank you. Well, we have a good long time for conversation, so I think I'm just going to throw it out and see what people have to say. I have some questions for the panelists myself, but I think with a big and enthusiastic crowd here, I'd rather hear what you'll have to ask. So please, I'm just going to call on people as I see them. So just go ahead, hands up.
I'm going to just throw this out there because that's where we ended. I'm really, I guess I want to think about what you're talking about rioting and disruption, and you talked about the police being surprised. What about police who provoke this kind of, who themselves infiltrate and conduct that kind of, anarchy for a certain effect to basically justify their own violence? To me, that's a really big and important issue when we look at a lot of the big, demonstrations that become very destruction of property, very violent. And I think think it's something that needs serious consideration in terms of the tactics of our national security forces. So maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, well, that's certainly a big issue from a tactical perspective, as you're talking about, and a practical perspective. As far as discourses go, I find that idea that, the concern over infiltrators provoking the police, that can be used or extended to the point where anyone who throws a rock is an infiltrator, and then there's literally no space whatsoever for people who if that's their mode of resistance. And I've seen this happen in many cases. So I question that narrative on a tactical level. You always have to watch out for that. You're always worried there's somebody coming out, not necessarily an infiltrator. Just could be impractical to have someone throwing rocks at any specific action. So that's something on an organizing level we always need to pay attention to, and you always need to watch out for infiltrators. But I do critique. I have spent some time critiquing that the discourse that focuses on that, because I have lots of comrades that and historically, the labor movement, any major labor movement around the turn of the 20th century, which is my specific period I studied. There's so much violence. It's so much more violent than anything that happens today in the United States. Miners had, mine strikes. There were guns. They would always smash up everything that the property owners had. That was very typical for big strikes. So I think that's a legitimate form of resistance, at least if you look at it historically. And I think it's certainly authentic. I don't think that I think lots of people who do it, they're doing it because that's the way they want to resist, not because they're infiltrators, even though we should watch out for infiltrators. And it also can come to the point of creating the discourse, which is exemplified by the Chris Hedges piece against the Black Bloc, that it's the way that social movements are going to succeed is if they're respectable enough and if they can cast out the bad elements within them. The cancer in the Occupy movement are anarchists, and they need to be thrown out. So when that discourse goes in that direction, I'm extremely critical. I certainly think it's a practical problem.
I feel like every week I read an article that is bitter and condescending, telling me not to go to grad school, that the tenured professor is becoming going to be an extinct species in the next 5 to 10 years. So with that, I think a common response is, well, there's all this potential for grad students, for PhD students, for adjunct professors to organize in response to reform academia. So I guess my question, and I guess this is an open-ended question, is how can that organizing happen in ways that don't reify and reproduce the kind of academy, the kind of Imperial academy that you're critiquing? How can adjuncts and grad students organize to reform the academy in ways that don't do that same appropriation of power and reappropriation of, like you said, of direct action and social behavior?
Well, if you figure it out, let me know, because that's something I really want to see. It's something I've tried to do at my university to some extent. I'm in Graduate Employees Together as a group at University of New Mexico where I go, and we've tried. Something I'd really like to see is for us to be graduate students to be in solidarity with the part-time instructors, adjunct faculty, because they're treated, at least at UNM, they're treated so badly. It's outrageous, and that's what the Subbaraman's piece that I quoted from. It's titled "In Different Spaces," and that's all about how about the extreme exploitation of adjunct faculty, and particularly women of color in adjunct faculty positions. So I think. Ideally, that, and in theory, that could be a great way to organize. I think one thing that would have to be done, just to make the university even to start to approach social justice is change the way the pay grade works. To have adjuncts making $10,000, $20,000 a year, and the distinguished professors making $100,000 a year. That's just, that has to change to even begin to talk about having having social justice at the university. So I would love to see lots of collaboration between organizing by adjunct professors and collaboration with graduate students and janitors and everyone on the university. That's the kind of thing I try to do, and so far it doesn't go anywhere, but that's life.
I actually have a question for Elizabeth, if that's okay. which is, well, unless you wanted to respond to that.
Oh, I was just going to respond really quickly and just say that actually I had an experience with like one of my housemates who's like a white straight male who was getting ready for an IWW workshop and was just kind of like, oh, you can't learn politics in the classroom. And I was like, oh, I disagree. Because I was like, we're always learning politics in the classroom. It's just like, whose politics are we learning? And so I do think that there's a really important intervention that needs to happen in terms of like disrupting like normative, hegemonic politics in the classroom, but also too following the lead of like the Black Campus Revolution or the Chicano Studies movement. Both of these movements were committed to transforming the entire academy. And so it wasn't just about the classroom, but about the whole structure. And so I think those are really important lessons to keep in mind when we talk about like the classroom and like politicizing the classroom.
I mean, one thing that hasn't come up, and even though I know this word gets bandied about a huge amount, which is why I'm loath to use it, but I will, is that all of you really are talking about neoliberalism, right? Which is aside from, although it's never aside from the economic angle, it's also the sense that the real action is happening on the level of the individual, right? So the real action is the individual coming out, right? That somehow that's going to do it, right? Just saying, I'm gay has kind of a priori a transformative process rather than a kind of critical pedagogy. Or the language of the act that you were talking about is so fascinating, right? Where what it opposes, among other things, is not treating people purely as individuals, right? Or the Singapore example, where gay men who have the economic wherewithal to travel many thousands of miles east to have sex with other men, which I imagine they could just as do well at home, somehow become the voice of gay liberation in Singapore, or sort of, and then Benjamin, what you were saying about, sort of that we talk about education so often as, and particularly in teaching-oriented institutions, as sort of, cultivating people, that it is sort of this individualized, that changing the person is somehow going to change the system. And I'm wondering, this seemed to me a real theme. I mean, even though all these presentations were very, very different, this seemed like a real theme, was sort of this neoliberal creep in terms of privileging the individual utterance, or individual self-making, or individual fun, even, to talk about social change. And I'm wondering maybe that might be a place to sort of try and tie all these presentations together. I don't know if that's what I got, but...
Yeah, I guess I can respond with, in HB 2281, the fourth line that says, advocate ethnic solidarity instead of treating people as individuals. When I first read it, it drove me nuts because it's not a parallel sentence, which is actually something that like the federal court judge made like snarky comments about in his brief, that he was just like, it's very difficult to make a ruling about this because it doesn't make any sense. But basically it's really interesting when you hear like what Tom Horn and Huppenthal, the two superintendents, say about it, is that like, so basically the state of Arizona commissioned an audit of the program, paid like upwards of $100,000 for this audit. The audit found the Mexican American Studies program not to be illegal under HB 2281. So the state's own evidence said that it wasn't illegal and shouldn't be dismantled, but the superintendent came up with his own page after that led to it. And so the audit said that students were treated as individuals, so that was very clear that in the classroom, individual opinions and perspectives were very much valued. And so because of the way that this is worded, instead of treating people as individuals means that if students are treated as individuals, then that fourth clause doesn't apply, essentially. But what's happening when like Huppenthal and Horn talk about it is they bank on this just like bizarre colorblindness, where they, we're talking about racism makes you racist because you are acknowledging race. And so they, again and again, this idea, it's like, in terms of like the individual's relationship to the state, it's a totally stripped down idea of the individual. Actually, Tom Horn regularly invokes going to the March on Washington and hearing MLK speak and say, I'm just, working in the tradition of MLK, and I want people to be treated by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Like, this is what, the number one racist in Arizona is saying. And, and so it's just this totally bizarre thing because, when students are being oppressed because of their membership in a class of people, and yet they're not allowed to resist unless they affirm their individuality and distance themselves from the community. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question for someone on Twitter who's watching on the live stream.
Oh, okay, fantastic.
It's for John Treat. She wants to know, does Yale faculty's protest of NUS venture on the grounds of the sodomy law liberalism overshadow the critique of neoliberalism? And even if Yale NUS is a neoliberal venture, how can it serve as a space to produce queer neoliberal critique?
Well, I suppose that will depend on who's involved with the project. And we'll see. It opens this fall, and they've hired faculty. I think it's an open question as to what will go on in the classroom in Singapore, what kinds of critique will be carried out, and if they are indeed guaranteed academic freedom, which we have assurances they will, then I anticipate that at least some of the 40 or 50 faculty that have been hired so far will take up those issues. I mean, on campus, I would say, I don't know what issue is overshadowing which issue. I've been particularly interested in LGBT rights in Singapore. Colleagues of mine have pursued other areas of concern about this venture. I wouldn't say that, I would say that it's a very multifarious debate that's going on in New Haven. Could I say something about the individual?
Sure, that'd be great.
And I don't know if I'm answering the question you meant to ask, but since Singapore was founded in 1965, the argument has been made by the state that the individual is of Western concern, and that under Asian values, which are terribly like autocratic values, it's the we, it's the collective. But in the case of Singapore, specifically the family, the family is seen as the fundamental unit of society, not the individual. And don't you think this is happening in this country as well? If you look at the debate over same-sex marriage, everything is the gay family, the lesbian family. The child is always there, even if the child isn't there.
Right. The child was phantasmatically there.
My forthcoming essay.
Yeah.
I mean, I see what's happening in this country, that no gay or lesbian politician will dare run unless she's married, has kids. And so there's a kind of a convergence going on in the political discourse in this country, in some quarters in this country and in Singapore, and it's not about the individual at all anymore.
Thank you everyone for these talks, they were really great. There was a comment before about the increasing downward mobility and precarization of faculty in the U.S., which seems to me to be one kind of side of the possibility of assuming conservative politics, right? As people are more concerned about their jobs, they're less and less they feel less and less entitled towards academic freedom. The other part that strikes me as relevant to kind of various papers here is the increasing I don't know how you want to say it, elitisation of the U.S. college body, in particular the assaults on affirmative action, the increasing tuition at U.S. public universities, and it seems to me particularly in the Yale Singapore example, right, there's a whole kind of, I mean, we're now operating in kind of various kind of groups of the elitization of various student bodies, right? Like they're interested, I presume the imagined student body in Singapore is going to be very rich, potential kind of future donors to the franchise. So, which also is parallel to the kind of this fantasy of kind of these elite circuit parties as also kind of constituting a certain kind of cross-class body politic. So I'm just interested to think about if the kind of the increasing kind of constriction into the diminishing opportunities for students in public education in the U.S. Might be another factor in any of your papers.
Does anyone want to jump in and respond? Or anyone from our assembled company? I mean, we certainly see that at CUNY, in the CUNY system, there's no question that, during the Occupy sort of efflorescence, a lot of CUNY schools had teach-ins, and I participated in one at Hunter, and I said, what I'd really love to do is tell students the history of Hunter College, because they don't really know it, and it's not that hard to find out. And one thing that I realized, I always knew it sort of inchoately, but realized as I was doing this research was that from the very beginning of the CUNY system, it was assumed that access and excellence were mutually inclusive. And we're at a point in public education where access and excellence are seen as mutually exclusive, and you have to pick one or the other. And that is a sea change from the beginning of the 20th century, certainly from the founding of public institutions during the land grant movement, but also during the progressive era and through into the 20s and 30s, up until the really up until people of color said we want in. It was assumed that access created excellence. That was assumed. Now it's assumed that access precludes excellence. And I think that's exactly the kind of, the eliticization of public education. And so we see the creation of phenomena like the Macaulay Honors College here at CUNY or other honors colleges that you see sort of all over public education. The decrease, particularly of African American men in colleges, and of course the concurrent increase of African American men in this country's prisons. I'm not telling you anything you already know. And the franchising of Ivy League universities, both through transnational projects and or Ivy League equivalents like NYU, of course, right, which connects with land grabs within where they are, that you see, happening certainly in New York City with Columbia and NYU, and CUNY, which is buying up parts of East Harlem like no tomorrow. And then sort of this franchising transnationally, and of course the whole MOOC thing at the same time, that then kind of raises these questions of, I'm sure this came up at Yale, right? Is it the same degree? Right? Are these students going to be as good as Yale undergraduates who have been fighting tooth and nail? And at the same time, if I were coming out of graduate school right now, I'd be like, hey, 40 new jobs in Singapore. I'll live in Singapore for a couple of years. 40 new jobs in Abu Dhabi. I don't know, so, there are those kinds of economic issues and sort of land issues, and this relationship between excellence and access at the same time. They're all kind of converging in these really, really interesting ways. And so, and like every kind of hydra, you tap one head and the other one sort of pops up. So it's hard even to know, when you were saying this movement against Singapore has been really multifaceted, that different people have different interests. And those people actually might have conflicting interests with each other, even as they have a shared project to oppose this particular, you could have academic elitists saying this is a watering down of the Yale brand, and people saying this is global neoliberalism,
they would have nothing, they wouldn't give each other the time of day on campus, and yet they join together in this odd bedfellows kind of.
That's fine, that's fine. You're right, I mean, some of us, myself included, have graduate students who have applied for jobs at Yale. We don't demonize anyone, who's looking for a job, but there are bigger issues at stake. And it's, at Davos this year, our vice president gave a speech where she talked explicitly about the branding of Yale, and now they refer to Yale USA. There's Yale in US. I think there are other Yales coming, and in fact, she spent 3 weeks in the Gulf recently. So I think something is coming. And about the elitization. I mean, Yale is not a particularly worldly institution. It's been very Euro-American centric. It's whole 300 years, and there's a sort of naivete. There's a naivete in the administration and the faculty, and I think that Singapore holds a special appeal. I mean, it's clean, like police states tend to be. Everyone speaks English. The people they meet in the Singapore government went to Oxford and Cambridge. It's Asia-lite. It's very easy. And they go there and they see something exotic. They see Asian people. They see people of Indian descent, Malay descent. For those of us that work in Asia, we see elites when we go there. And so there's a cognitive dissonance between the often romantic or Orientalist fantasies that some of our administrators have, and a different approach that those of us who have lived there have.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm just going to pop back and forth from side to side. So,
I wanted to bring back one of Janine's interventions from this morning about the ways that homonationalism has been co-opted by the academy and made it to this piece of theory, and bringing it back to sort of like the material state of how homonationalism is propagated by the U.S. Imperial agenda, by the Zionist machine, and also in conversation with your point in particular about what exactly we want to do with homonationalism, how dilute can it be, how far do we want to spread it, right? And so I was wondering if the panelists could address how you see your work connecting to the project of dismantling Zionism and U.S. imperialism.
I mean, ideally, I'd like to, in terms of dismantling Zionism and U.S. imperialism, I'd like to see that done materially and yesterday, if not sooner. There's not the will for that at the moment, but that's the kind of thing I want to see, is sabotage campaigns, whatever it takes to get rid of U.S. imperialism. And that's why I think that example of the Afghans for Peace March is so inspiring, because it was direct action against the war, like happened in 2003 in San Francisco. I do take, as I assume you noticed, I take a broad view of homonationalism, and that was a nod to Scott Morganson's work on settler homonationalism. And that's something that at UNM we've been talking about a lot recently, and Morganson's work is important in the American Studies program at UNM. So it's resisting the kinds of queer anthropology that uses Native peoples as a kind of universal LGBT history, and just the idea that, I mean, the whole idea of LGBT inclusion valorizes, assumes the legitimacy of the state, while the radical versions of Native studies say that the United States itself, the whole idea of that the United States government has sovereignty over the areas it claims to have sovereignty is questioned, is rejected by the radical currents in Native studies. So those acts by LGBT people. I think like the rainbow-colored U.S. flag, that's homonationalism for me. Mm-hmm. And also just all the don't ask, don't tell stuff, which is really big. In Albuquerque, the Outserve led the last Pride parade, gay Pride parade in Albuquerque, which is the pro-imperialist active duty and veterans group. So I do think that, I do want to see the homonationalism addressing all of those kind of things while simultaneously still focusing on, still having the emphasis on Palestine and opposing the occupation. But I guess I am somewhat, I don't know how to feel about the really long distance kind of solidarity relationships. And I'm really worried when I see people like only caring about things that are really far away from them when they live under a settler state, when, they're in institutions that are actively colonial, like University of New Mexico is. The police at UNM, their job is to harass houseless folks, especially indigenous houseless folks. So I want to see it connected. I want to see both things happen to smash all that kinds of homonationalism, both within what's now called the continental United States and in the Middle East and everywhere.
Anyone on the side? Yes, go ahead.
I just want to raise something, and it's not really a question, it's a comment. And that is, I live in Toronto, and part of Kids Against Israeli Apartheid, and we are battling constantly a sort of neoliberal rhetoric. And right now, this whole question of whether we can march in the parade or not is based on the question of are we making people uncomfortable by marching in the parade? And it's at City Hall, at the city, which gives money to the Pride Parade, which I wish Pride didn't take. I think they take it. And there's a whole, but this whole question of normalcy and people saying, well, we wish you would just make make a fuss. Why are you doing this? And I think it's important because this relates to the stuff that's going on in education. And I was an anti-racist. I sort of introduced the anti-racist program in education in Toronto, and it's and you have to ask yourself the question: what happened? Why didn't we make connections? Why was it, now that it's so normal that people are objecting now to us raising any other issues that that might upset them. So it's just, but yes.
Yeah, something that happens a lot that I see is, because the master narrative of the Black freedom struggle is written as a civil rights movement, then when the gay rights movement, as a civil rights movement, right, can make analogies between gay rights and civil rights in the Black freedom struggle without thinking about the Black freedom struggle as much more than legislation and Supreme Court decisions. And so sometimes I think that those sorts of failure to connect like the larger issues of the state and capitalism comes from maybe the ways that we teach about like the anti-racist struggle, or the way that we teach about the feminist struggle, or teach about gay rights. And that's why I want to go into education, because I think that we have to like resuscitate those much more radical histories of anti-racist struggles, while simultaneously saying like, no, you can't make these analogies between like the queer diaspora and racism, colonialism, xenophobia in the US, because they function differently. And I think until like queers are willing to, and especially white queers are willing to kind of like release that, I don't know, affinity for the civil rights movement as being like, that they're in the footsteps of it, and are willing to like recognize like white privilege and settler privilege, that it's going to be very difficult to like untangle those, like very different histories, and we'll probably continue to see like elite queers become part of these nationalist imperialist schemes.
Yeah.
This is a question about coming out in the classroom, and the classroom is about relationships, and so I just want to ask a question about what happens when you change the location. What happens to coming out when you change the location from the classroom, where it's usually one teacher and a lot of students, to another location on campus where students and teachers interact, but more personally office hours. And I wonder if coming out and the decision to come out, the politics of coming out, changing office hours, and I'm thinking, especially because a lot of times queer kids or proto-queer kids come to your office hours in order to sort of not come out, but come out to you and talk about being queer, to not really saying it, and they sort of want you to say it. You're not a person who coming out makes sense for, right? So there's an individual relationship. It almost seems therapeutic in office hours. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and it's funny because I think back at, my years as an undergrad, and I totally did that same thing, right? Go into my advisor's office and kind of just like play around with that. But yeah, I hadn't thought about the space of like office hours and what that does to it. But I think, me personally, I think that would be a moment where I would feel more comfortable because it is more of an interpersonal interaction where you can have those little off-the-cuff comments, or maybe they'll see a picture in your cubicle or something where it allows, if you will, that golden moment. It's not necessarily a teaching moment, but a golden moment in like interpersonal interaction where you could more freely bring up, a personal comment where you could out yourself, right? Where it wouldn't be as odd. Because like some of the narratives I read, they were talking about how like, oh well, I don't want to just walk into the classroom and be like, here's the syllabus, I'm lesbian, okay, you're good. Because it's just like, what does that do? That just ends the conversation there. But thinking about it in the context of office hours, I think that's really interesting and intriguing. And I didn't see any mention of that coming up in the narratives that I read, but I can imagine that once professors do come out, that if there are queer questioning or identifying students in that classroom or in those classes, that even more so they would feel comfortable to come to office hours and maybe seek advice, or just to chat and feel a certain connection beyond just in the classroom.
Could I say something?
Yeah, absolutely. Jump in.
On my campus, we have a lot of celebrity homosexuals. There's no one wonders if Michael Warner is gay or not. I mean, and John Treat and George Chauncey, we write books about it, so there are no secrets. So there are all of these gay men and women that are out, but among the gay men anyway, you know what, there's one thing, people never come out about being HIV positive. I mean, that's another kind of coming out, which I don't know any HIV positive gay man on the faculty who has talked about that in the classroom. Maybe they have, and I just don't know about it. But the issues, I mean, coming out as a homosexual has sort of gotten easy with HIV/AIDS now, because that is now the tough conversation to have in class. And coming out just opens up a whole chain of other questions, and you can easily lose control of the classroom.
Well, yeah, I think the rhetoric of containment is still very hard and strong with HIV, where maybe we've moved beyond that with coming out, regarding our sexuality, where we have a little more flexibility in that. But yeah, definitely that would be something very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Hi, Heather. I was wondering if you've explored at all the ways that the stakes change when questions of racial and ethnic difference come into play. I think depending on the environment you're in, sometimes whiteness is many times whiteness is an attribute that allows for a connection that maybe one mode of difference can overcome. And so have you read anything, have you done any work that explores the changing stakes associated with multiple modes of difference?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because the narratives that are available generally come from white, middle-aged women. Very few male narratives, and basically no mention of race. Very, very little mention of race. Like, out of the 100 narratives or more that I read, I could maybe think of a couple, like a handful. So it's definitely something that's missing, and it's something that as I continue this project, I would like to personally collect some narratives of my own and actually, interview different professors and talk about this, because, that intersectionality has to impact that process so much, to a point where, that this needs to be talked about, and the fact that it's not, I think, kind of cues the problem, right? And just me personally speaking, as a white lesbian who is in higher education, I had those privileges afforded to me where, if I feel comfortable in that context and I have that connection or that moment where I can come out, I do have that advantage where it's just, well, that's just one strike, I guess, instead of 2, 3, or 4. But it's definitely something interesting. Now, the only time that diversity came up within the narratives was when it was related to when someone would say, well, I would feel more comfortable coming out when I was working on the East Coast versus when I moved to Lincoln, Nebraska. You know what I mean? So then it goes into not the identity of the professor, but the classroom, the students. And how if there were diverse classes, then professors generally felt more comfortable coming out. Whereas if they were in more of a conservative state where diversity lacked, then they felt like, okay, I need to not talk about this.
Although it's interesting, and particularly connecting to what Elizabeth said, that political orientation and diversity are not the same thing, right? So you can be in Arizona, which is, multiracial, in many ways, and yet there's not political space to talk about various things, right? And certainly in Nebraska, you're going to have as many queer students in Nebraska as you are anywhere else. I think it's more about what is allowed to be said or what's seen as appropriate to say in the space of the classroom, rather than necessarily even the bodies who are in the classroom. Okay, this side. Any other people have? Yeah, in the back. Yeah, that's you. Yes, you are in the back. Ish.
So I want to ask what sounds like a simplistic question, but I don't really mean it that way. And the question is, so I'm going to say it and then I'm going to contextualize it. What are the productive possibilities of the classroom? So I see a couple of, I see a lot of interconnectedness in all of these presentations. But if we're to take everything that everyone said seriously, the classroom is a thing that is owned by the corporate university, is exported by the corporate university in its current state to sites around the world, right, is a place where, as the gentleman in the suit over there said, somehow we're not having personal relationships, right? Those are for office hours, where we presume a certain amount of normativity, or normative selves among our faculty, not just, I think the idea of coming out is important, not so much in saying to students, I have this particular identity category that might be invisible to you. For some of us, it isn't invisible. But also saying, and that identity category means that when I teach you the traditional disciplinary knowledge that I'm paid to teach you, it actually does a certain amount of psychic harm to me, right? Like, as a sociologist, am I required to teach my students the studies of gay parents that show that, their kids might have certain forms of maladjustment, right? If some sociologists believe that their methodologies are valid, am I required to teach those to my students? And is my coming out to say to them, this actually really sucks for me to stand up here and lecture you on this stuff that I think is bullshit, right? But it's part of the core curriculum or whatever. Or let me teach you all of these other, dead white people that I think are not as interesting as some of the other people that, you've got to wait until you're a senior to learn. And so I really want to kind of take seriously all of these critiques of things like queer theory, right, as a kind of limited or co-opting counter discourse, but then say to all of you, right, who spend an awful lot of time in classrooms, okay, so now what, right? Because we have these students, some of whom actually really want to imagine dynamic activist lives for themselves. And we have our responsibilities as people who are functioning within the constraints of this corporatized environment. So what now?
You can answer that question? Please feel free.
I have like a follow-up question to it, which is thinking about like queer precarity in the institution, and I missed the first part of the panel, so people may have touched on this, but coming from a school where you recently had a whole lot of stuff happen around a queer studies professor, and like a really unsupported program. I'm just wondering, sort of to jump off on your question, like when there are professors who do teach their radical politics, whether they're like peer professors or POC professors who like turn their classrooms into activist spaces and then their jobs are like threatened because of that. If people have like strategies or ways of addressing that kind of precarity, I'm really curious to hear about it.
I'm actually interested to hear from people here what you all think, what experiences. I think this seems like a place where we can really sort of share expertise and knowledge and ideas. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess this is going to be a bit aiming because I'm sort of thinking about in relation to some other previous comments. But I guess part of what I also want to encourage us to think about is sort of how the university came and how we came to think about and now need to unseat the notion of the university as this liberatory space. So we may need to think about second-wave feminists who were refugees from the New Left, who turned to the university as a site where they could have conversations that they couldn't have in the sexist New Left, right? Like the university actually was a space that was seen as productive. And so I want to think maybe about these kinds of spaces. And again, to differentiate between the early gay rights movement and civil rights movement, Michael Warner makes this great point that like capitalism and gay rights are actually really intricately linked because capitalist private spaces were gay-friendly spaces in ways that churches and other public spaces just weren't. So if we want to think critically about the university, we might need to think about our own university histories and how they came to take the shape that they did. And I guess the same with exporting the university. I was talking to someone who attended briefly the American University in Cairo. And he said one of the most amazing things was how many brilliant women were at the American University in Cairo. And they were at the American University in Cairo because they came from wealthy Egyptian families that were quite conservative, who wanted their daughters to go to university, but unlike their sons, were unwilling to send them to the United States because they wanted to be able to keep them close to home to control them there. So I want to think critically about the way in which the university has, and still in many contexts, is this space, even though it's constantly being deformed, and how these spaces like come into existence sort of sometime at the very margins and sometimes, I don't know, like just to think critically about that aspect. And the same actually, I wanted to ask the first presenter about non-ascriptive coming out. So I can no less imagine myself not as a feminist than I could as a gay man. Like, I actually I don't know who I would be. Or as a Marxist. So to come out to my students, for me actually involves less coming out as a gay man. I just assume that, I don't know, I teach in Montreal, they're going to figure that out.
Although, can I just interrupt and say that's not true? Because I teach in New York City, and I teach courses on masculinity, sexuality, gender, blah, 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 blah. And I taught a class on masculinity. I teach 19th century American lit. So masculinity before the Civil War. And I swear to God, my one trans student, or at least out trans student, came up to me afterwards, who was my advisee, and said, you know, so people are just debating, like, is she or isn't she? And I was like, and there were openly lesbian and gay students in the class. And so I think that we can never assume anything. They knew my politics, right? Much more because I was teaching this course on masculinity. We're talking about, you know, like white masculinity, the construction of Native Americans in the 1820s and blah, blah, blah. But because I never said, oh, and by the way, you know, and even those students who come to my office house and see a picture of me and my partner, like, right at my desk, you know, what they see is the picture of my kids. And since I have kids, of course I can't be a dyke. So, you know, I think we just say in sort of this blithe way, well, of course it's obvious. And this really opened my eyes in a way that because I just assumed that I didn't have really to say anything explicit because it was so obvious. But what is obvious to us as peers is not obvious when that power relationship kicks in, right? The same way, like, I don't know how tall my students are because they're always sitting down. And then I run into them on the street and I'm like, my God, you're tall, right? That to me is exactly that same thing. They know how tall I am, right? I don't actually know what they look like below the waist, all right? So, you know, so that, I think continually underestimate the power relationship continually, and I'm not sure that it ever can be undone. Even within, like in your department, the chair of your department is theoretically your peer, but she's not. And as much as she wants to say she's your peer, she's not. She has power, and she's to acknowledge that power, otherwise she's abusing it. You know? So those, unless we're like, okay, let's just, smash. Either we smash everything, right? And I'm not, right? Whatever, right? Either we smash everything. How? I don't know. Maybe Benjamin can give us tips. Or we have to recognize that these power relationships actually do exist, and what we imagine to be obvious is not obvious at all to those people over whom we have power.
But I guess that also sort of led to my third possible coming out, which is coming out as a mother. So I have a colleague in my department who had to arrive late to a conference, and she'd been exhausted because her child was sick, and so she apologized to her class for being like 5 minutes late. And one of the students said, well, if you can't have kids and teach at the same time, then maybe you shouldn't be doing it. She then spent the next 10 minutes laying this I think two of the recent example that was all over the headlines of the woman who had the sick kid, who had to bring him to class, to lecture, and breastfed in the middle of class.
Right.
I think part of what it's pushing towards is the notion of the university as a public space and incorporating our private lives into that, whether they're queer private lives or maternal private lives or analytic private lives that color my research as a scholar as much as they color my daily life. So I guess I want to just think about what that actually means. And how we can sort of think beyond the queer, both historically and in our contemporary discussions.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, just thinking about kind of what do we do in the classroom if the university is becoming more corporate, if neoliberal forces are changing the very nature of the university. I think it's still up to us to imagine it as a contested space, that it's still always contested, and we just have to participate in that battle like these other forces are. In terms of coming out, I know part of the kind of homonormative rhetoric and neoliberal rhetoric is this I thing that creates me as an identity in the classroom, but I think coming out, particularly in my experience with my body as a Black man coming out in the CUNY system in New York, it does powerful work in terms of challenging who can produce knowledge, who can stand in a space, what the very nature of the university is, the classroom, right? And I think that's a means of contesting the normalization of the university, right, in multiple ways.
So take one more comment and we'll throw it back to the panel, if that's okay. Yeah. Yes.
I just want to follow up there because I feel like reducing the I voice to a neoliberal position, I mean, that is one way to understand speaking in the I voice, and it's an important way to understand what can happen to the I voice and who's in charge of the I. But the I voice is also a feminist position, and when it comes from a deeply politicized, theoretical, activist stance about exchange of knowledge and what occurs in a classroom, it's not just function. I mean, I think we need to have a conversation about the I voice and the I and what it means to be personal and how the personal is the political in both directions. It's not to say it isn't neoliberal or increasingly neoliberal, but not to undermine however many years of radical teaching that I think you were thinking back to, say, for Mexican American students in California, that is so deeply written into the radicalization of an I experience for everyone in the classroom that reaches out into their communities, for instance. So I don't think we want to lose that as we understand the way that we're being constructed to be I's by a neoliberal state or neoliberal institution. So it's like, how do we have both of those conversations at the same time? Because the project that is being destroyed in Arizona, as you described it, and the reason it's being destroyed is because they understand its radical threat. They understand its radical potential. They understand that this is something that is about liberating children in a liberatory rhetoric. And that is a feminist pedagogy that's being dismantled, and of color, feminist of color pedagogy, radical pedagogy. And I think a lot of us do that in our classrooms, in or out of the I voice, in and out of the coming out I voice. So how do we think about that and pressure? the neoliberal voice.
Okay, we're going to throw it back to the panel for a little while, and then we're going to go back here, and then I think we're done. Yes, go ahead.
So emancipatory pedagogy is theorized as radical contextualism, a theory of contexts, and it's all about like contextual intervention. And so when you think about emancipatory pedagogy and what that looks like in the classroom, it's like totally based on like what the context of the classroom is. And actually I think the success story of Mexican American Studies is that by having 10 plus years to cultivate this student empowerment and engagement with the community, that would actually happen when MAS came under attack, that there was a massive mobilization in Tucson. And some of the success stories are that they were able to vote out the school board and vote in 4 people who were in favor of Mexican American Studies. There was mobilization to challenge the constitutionality of HB 2281, in which one part of it was knocked out. But the big thing is that actually the federal desegregation mandate has been reinstated, and Tucson is now back under federal oversight, which means that the state can no longer intervene with TUSD curriculum. So because there was this like huge commitment to having students understand their own context and their own power within that context, they're able to build a community that could defend itself. And now you have this federal desegregation mandate working in tandem with a pro-MAS TUSD school board, along with, like a lot of community muscle. And so I think that that's one of like the ways that we can think about how, if we want to, think about MAS as a model, not to just simply be like exported and reproduced, but instead to think about it as a practice in radical contextualization, then like that's something that we can all be inspired by, and to think about like how to apply that in our own classrooms.
Take 2 more comments. So theoretically, we have till 5:15. That seems like a very, very long time, but theoretically, that's when we have till. So I think let's have a couple more comments, and then we'll call it a day. Is that okay? Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to bring the conversation back to that point that you made earlier about the revolution necessitating that academics commit class suicide, because I think a lot of our focus on the sort of individual identity positions of academics and who we are, whether it's queer academics or queer of color academics or people of color academics, sort of erases the class position that is inherent in like assimilating into the academic institution. And I think many of these presentations are talking about neoliberalism in the ways that academia as something that is implicated in maintaining hegemony because it requires that hegemony to have something to theorize about. Is sort of erasing the ways that knowledge production itself is a capitalist project that is performed on the unwaged labor of people who are participating in social movements. So if we're thinking about the university and how we can participate in the university and still maintain like a materialist analysis of the world, I don't know, I'm becoming more and more frustrated that there's this move towards identity positions and identity politics without like a deep understanding of class, labor, and capitalism and how they function within the university.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right on, and that's something I want to see more of, and I want academics to take that seriously. As I've said, in making that argument, I'm drawing on Irvin, who, in writing about whiteness, says that that's what white folks need to do is be in solidarity with people of color movements and expect that our own privilege has to end. That has to be the goal, is to destroy that. So I think that both the material position that some in the academy have, but also like the privileged epistemological position and the social status that comes with being an academic, I think that has to go away too. Or the material matters a lot more to me, but ideally, that's what I argue for, is that if you, in a world of freedom and equality, there wouldn't be so much weight given to the PhD. There wouldn't be so much weight, and certainly that if you wanted to have if you didn't like your chair, for example, or you didn't like your department, you wouldn't have to worry about starving or going homeless if you wanted to go somewhere else. But those are the material realities we deal with right now, and I think that definitely needs to be acknowledged and transformed.
I think just to add on the idea of the coming out narrative, I just want to push back on that and how it's related to like material realities of homonationalism and the ways that like for the majority of queer people who are a majority of queer people of color, like as a whole in the world, coming out often implicates a certain kind of lack of safety and a move towards being dissociated from family and towards like survival economies that is not the same as the coming out narrative that is generally complicated by white gay men.
Well, I'd say yes and no, actually. I mean, I'll give you an example here. I'm teaching a queer lit after 1945 course in the English department at Hunter, and I would say, since it's Hunter College, of all the students in it, only one is a US-born child of US-born parents. Is that right? Yes. So we're talking, majority, or alternatively, only one is a white US-born child of US-born parents. There we go. In other words, my students are, migrants to the US, children of migrants to the US, working class, and/or people of color. Right? And for them, in fact, it's interesting. They're much more ambivalent than what you're saying suggests, in that the coming out narrative actually has huge power for them, even as they recognize its shortcomings for their experience. It's not an either-or. They're very, very compelled by it, and I think that, and they want to actively self-identify as queer, even as they want to continually kind of wonder what queer means and what it means for them. So the coming out is actually really present in their lives, with their families, with their friends, and that the material risks that coming out engenders are very real to them. But so I think, one thing that Heather was saying is, the stories as they are published in the world are very white, are very bourgeois. The stories as they're experienced by the people that we teach, not so much. And I think we need to differentiate then between the narratives that are available out there in the published universe and the narratives that we're actually experiencing as teachers and as students every day, because they're not the same. You know what I mean? I'm sorry that I jumped in and go over that talk, because I know we have time for one more comment. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I think I just want to maybe demystify a couple of things that I hear happening that are kind of frightening. I don't do this, so this feels very weird. But I guess I'm coming out now since we're having this conversation about a lot of things. Like, the assumption that academics have some kind of shared class position is not. I am an adjunct professor. I don't make any money, literally any money. I make less than minimum wage when we work out the number of hours that I work. I make similar to what my working class mother makes, who's worked in this country for almost 30 years now, right? Which just speaks to how capitalism works in the US and that kind of stuff. But the idea that academics somehow fall into the same class, that they're all the same kind of person, completely invisibilizes the experiences of people like me who come from really, really, really violently poor backgrounds and the effect of that on my life completely colored my going into academia, right? Because here was a place where, as a graduate student, I could receive a stipend and drop one of my jobs and defer loans. So my decision to enter academia wasn't economic. It wasn't because, I have a research project that I love and all that, but it was also this pays me more money.
It's a good deal.
So the assumption that there's a shared class position is really, really, really problematic and invisibilizes people who got most of their degrees until my PhD, where I am at a really weird, bougie, private university where I know for a fact I was taken in because I'm not white, right? And the entire department is. And I get treated like that. like in very specific ways, and it's really violent and really traumatizing, right? So like these sort of things going back and forth about like academics needing to like do these particular kinds of things really does a similar kind of violence to people who have had to go into academia. I mean, I know it sounds ridiculous because people assume it's such a privileged position, but like in a lot of ways it's not. In a lot of ways it was a decision between like, am I going to keep like cleaning people's toilets, or am I gonna go read some books? And it's like, yeah, let me go read some books. You know what I mean? Like, let you pay me to read some books. And let me go and try to get into some really bougie school in my town because I know they'll take me because I have this background and they think that's special, right? And I'll make them diverse. So like I understand the politics of like why I am where I am. I understand how they treat me because of it. So like they want you in there, but then the second that you get in there, they treat you like crap. They treat you like, we know that's what you were doing before you walked into this place, right? So like the presumption that like this thing called academia is made up of all these people who somehow when you get to this point, when you have this PhD, you're all the same is completely false. Because who that person that I'm talking about is still who I am. It's still like how I have to interact with my family. It's still how like my stipend gets cut up between like me and my mother and taking care of my sister. Like, do you know what I mean? So like, it's not as simple, I feel. And so all that goes into, you know, on an academic level, the things that I want to research, the things that I write about, the things that I teach. But it's very disconcerting, I think, to come into like a conference like this and sort of hear these conversations that super generalize this thing called academics, which then does that thing that like my own university does to me, which makes me feel like, so I'm not an academic, right? Because I don't fall into like this conversation that y'all are having. So I hope that addresses something.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Let's applaud our presenters, our audience. Thank you everyone for a wonderful conversation.